In 2019, Stephanie was 33 years old and on the outside lived a life many envied. A spacious house, a new car, frequent trips, and a husband adored in social circles. But inside, she was a broken woman, emotionally isolated, worn down by living with a man who knew how to hurt without ever raising his voice. Brandon was the kind of person who smiled at others and then wounded you with a funny comment that made everyone laugh, except the victim. Stephanie, with her quiet demeanor and meticulous heart, gradually learned to endure it, to pretend it didn't hurt, and to place each humiliation in an invisible box. But little by little, her inner space began to shrink. The worst part of living with someone like Brandon was the silence. Not the comforting silence between two people who understand each other without words, but the kind of silence that screams, that weighs heavily. Inside that well-decorated house, Stephanie walked on eggshells, as if every step might trigger an emotional landmine. When he arrived home from work, she already knew his mood just by the sound of the doorknob. If he was in a bad mood, a single glance could make her crumble. But it was at parties, those cursed parties, where his mask shone the brightest. In front of their friends, he treated her like a broken ornament, making jokes about her too much free time, her dramatic sensitivity, and how she wouldn't survive without him. And everyone laughed, thinking it was just biting humor. No one imagined the damage those words caused in someone who was already wondering whether she was worthy of love. Stephanie never reacted, never in front of others. She had developed a kind of silent resistance, like a wall of polished concrete. No one could see the cracks, but inside, she had been collapsing for a long time. When they returned home after one of those humiliating nights, she would pretend to be tired and head straight to the bedroom. Sometimes she cried quietly in the bathroom, with the shower running just to mask the sound. Other times she just lay there staring at the ceiling, wondering at what point she had stopped being herself. What hurt wasn't just the contempt, but the doubt. Was she exaggerating? Was he right? After all, he never hit her, never yelled. He just mocked, just made her feel small, just made her feel invisible. The turning point didn't come with a scream or a fight. It came with a drunken signature on some napkin at a random bar on a Saturday night, when Brandon thought it was funny to write, "I promise that if you ever leave me, you get everything. Signed, the idiot who can't live without you." He thought it was hilarious. Laughed so hard he cried, showed it to his friends and then forgot all about it. But Stephanie kept the napkin, and that night she didn't cry. For the first time in years, she felt something different, a spark, a flicker of return. The next day, she showed the napkin to Jenny, her best friend since college, a sharp-tongued lawyer with a loyal heart. Jenny looked at it with a mix of pity and fury and said, "This could become a legal agreement, you know." Stephanie didn't answer right away, but something inside her began to shift, as if for the first time she had a silent weapon in her hands. From that day on, Stephanie became an observer. She started documenting everything, discreetly, meticulously. She bought an external hard drive, one of those small, easy-to-hide ones. She saved screenshots, messages, call logs, even audio recordings. Brandon, in his arrogance, never noticed. He still thought he was untouchable, laughing loudly at his own cruel jokes and sneaking off to suspicious meetups while she pretended not to notice. But Stephanie saw everything, felt everything, only now with different eyes. The pain was still there, but it came with a plan. She would no longer be a spectator of her own devaluation. She would prepare. Cold, discreet, patient. She didn't want revenge. She wanted freedom, but a safe freedom. Jenny was essential in this process. With her straightforward and sharp manner, she helped Stephanie understand which pieces of evidence had legal value, how to structure the documentation, what could be used in the case of a divorce. "It doesn't have to be a war, it has to be smart," she would say. And Stephanie listened. Over time, she began to act with almost military control. There was no room for impulse. The plan was to wait for the right moment. Even when Brandon came home wearing a strange perfume, or when she heard whispers on the phone, ending with him laughing and saying, "Of course, my wife suspects nothing," she swallowed it all. Because now she knew. She was building her escape with the calmness of someone who had realized that pain wasn't just suffering anymore. It was fuel. The peak of contempt came on what seemed like an ordinary day, a dinner at his parents' house. Brandon got home late from work, walked in without even greeting. Her changed clothes and said, "Let's go, you look decent enough." She didn't respond. In the car, silence. At dinner, he was the same as always, the venomous clown. He loudly stated that a woman who lives off Pinterest knows nothing about real life, while his mother laughed and his father pretended not to hear. Then, in front of the entire family, he mentioned he was thinking of buying a smaller apartment just for himself, and looked directly at Stephanie, as if he already knew how deeply that would cut her. She smiled, a smile Brandon didn't notice, but Jenny, who was also there, caught it. That was when the two of them exchanged a look of complicity. Something was about to change. The final straw, however, came in the form of cruel irony. A month before Christmas, Stephanie found a note in the pocket of his jacket, a hurriedly scribbled draft of a plan Brandon and his friend Nate were scheming. "Christmas will be epic. She won't know what to do. Can't wait to see the little princess crying in front of Mommy." Stephanie read it silently, her hands cold and her stomach turning. She didn't confront him. She kept the paper. And at that moment, she was certain he was planning humiliation as a performance, a final blow. But he had no idea she had been planning her own, with more elegance, more strategy, and a strength he never imagined she had. The Christmas table would not be the stage of her defeat. It would be the day he tasted the bitter lesson of underestimating the wrong woman. On Christmas Eve, Stephanie barely slept, not out of fear, but from the adrenaline of what was to come. While everyone else thought about dinner, gifts, and family gatherings, she mentally reviewed every step of the plan. She organized the documents, checked the saved audio files, printed the most incriminating conversations, and prepared copies of the prenuptial agreement, now notarized and validated by Jenny. She placed everything in a golden envelope, one of those thick, elegant, heavy paper ones. In the mirror, she put on red lipstick like armor, and on the way to her in-laws' house, sitting in the passenger seat, she simply listened to Brandon humming an old song, relaxed, thinking that night would mark the end of the fragile woman he believed he still controlled. The house was full, loud laughter, children running around, the smell of roast turkey in the oven. Brandon greeted everyone as if he were the star of the evening, holding Stephanie's waist with fake tenderness. She smiled back, serene, almost sweet, but with eyes that knew exactly what was about to happen. During dinner, Nate arrived late, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and a mischievous look of complicity for Brandon. They exchanged a handshake, followed by a muffled whisper that only the attentive would catch. Stephanie pretended not to notice, took part in conversations, answered her aunt's questions, complimented her mother-in-law's cooking. But her heart beat with a steady rhythm. It wasn't fear, it was the final march toward freedom. It was after dessert, while everyone was still seated at the table, laughing and reminiscing about past Christmases, that Brandon stood up. He lightly tapped his glass with a fork and asked for everyone's attention, wearing a smile dripping with arrogance. "Guys, I have a little present for Stephanie," he said, pulling out a plain, crumpled envelope from inside his blazer, with her name hastily scribbled on it. Jenny, sitting 2 chairs away, set her fork down and leaned back discreetly. Stephanie took the envelope, opened it calmly, read the first few lines, and looked up, serene. "Divorce?" she said, with a light, almost amused smile. Brandon let out a loud laugh. "Surprise," he said, expecting a broken reaction that never came. Stephanie took a deep breath, placed the paper back in the envelope, and unhurriedly reached for her purse. From it, she pulled out the golden envelope. "So it really is gift night," she said, her voice clear, firm, and polite. She handed him the envelope, which he took with a raised eyebrow, still thinking he was in control. He opened it, read it again. Silence fell like a thick curtain over the room. The paper trembled in his hands. It was the original prenuptial agreement, signed by him while drunk, now officially registered. The document stated that in the case of separation due to infidelity or abandonment, she would keep the house, the cars, the joint account, and 70% of the marital assets. The clause was highlighted in yellow, and attached to the document a separate sheet, the evidence, receipts, screenshots, audio files, everything. Brandon turned pale. He tried to laugh nervously, saying it was a joke, that the napkin was never serious. But the notarized copy, with certified signatures and confirmation by 2 witnesses, including Nate himself, left no room for doubt. Nate, upon hearing his name, widened his eyes. "You used my signature on that?" he burst out, surprised, looking at Brandon like someone who realizes, too late, that he was part of a much more dangerous game than he thought. The once festive atmosphere plunged into uncomfortable silence. His mother-in-law covered her mouth with her hand. Brandon's father, who had always remained aloof, simply lowered his gaze, as if finally understanding the extent of what his son was capable of. And that was when Stephanie, still standing, kept her elegant posture but dropped the final bomb. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, calmly placing her hand over her belly. "I'm pregnant." The announcement, simple and direct, echoed like thunder through the room. She didn't smile. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She simply declared it with the same firmness one would use to read a bank statement. Brandon was speechless. The weight of the information was more than emotional. It was legal. The pregnancy further validated her rights, made the agreement even more solid, and left him at a total disadvantage. The man who had tried to destroy her in front of everyone was now cornered, vulnerable, and exposed, and there was nothing he could do to reverse it. Brandon tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He stammered something about talking later, and reached out his hand, trying to regain some control with a gesture that no longer had any effect. Stephanie simply stepped away. Nate, uncomfortable with the tension, stood up, muttering that he didn't know anything about this, trying to save his own skin. Brandon's mother, once always complicit in her son's rudeness, now looked at him as if seeing a stranger for the first time. And Jenny just smiled with her eyes, proud, as she held her wine glass like someone quietly celebrating a victory. The entire room had changed temperature. There were no more laughs, only the sound of cutlery being gently set down and the echo of humiliation stamped across Brandon's face. Without raising her voice, Stephanie thanked everyone for the evening and calmly walked toward the door. She stopped only to hug her cousin, Elena, who had tears in her eyes, and to gently kiss the forehead of Beth, her older sister, who had also witnessed so many silences without ever knowing how to act. "Everything's going to be okay now," she said, more to herself than to the others. And then she left. With her coat over her arm, her head held high, and the light steps of someone who, for the first time in years, was walking without the invisible weight of shrinking herself to fit into a relationship that always made her feel small. Outside, the December wind touched her face, but she felt an inner warmth that didn't come from the weather. It came from liberation. The next morning, before the sun even rose, Stephanie was already up. She had slept only a few hours, but felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The first thing she did was call the security company and have all the house locks changed. The second was to call the bank and freeze the joint account until the legal process was formally concluded. No impulsiveness. Everything followed the plan previously outlined with Jenny. The third action of the day was the most symbolic. She removed, piece by piece, all of Brandon's clothes from the closet. She placed everything in boxes with simple labels, "Story closed." When she finished, she took a deep breath and opened the windows of the house. Let the wind in, sweep the corners, and chase away the ghosts. That home, once so oppressive, now had a new scent, a new light, a new energy. Stephanie walked through the rooms with the feeling that she was treading on new territory, even without having changed addresses. She spent some time sitting on the floor of the room that would be the baby's, hands on her still subtle but present belly. She didn't yet know if it would be a boy or a girl, but she knew that this child would never grow up in an environment of fear. She promised there, in silence, that things would be different, that love wouldn't be something that hurts or belittles, that what she had lived through would serve as a milestone, the end of a toxic cycle and the beginning of a life based on choice, not survival. For the first time, the silence in that house was comforting. In the days that followed, Stephanie experienced a kind of silent mourning. Not for the end of the marriage, she didn't miss that, but for the time she had spent believing that what she had was love. She cried a few times, not because she wanted Brandon back, but because she remembered the version of herself that shrank in the face of jokes, that doubted her own worth. They were cleansing tears, not tears of longing. And each time she allowed herself to feel, she felt stronger afterward. With Jenny's support, she began to organize her routine without the shadows of the past. She scheduled medical appointments, renovated the baby's room, refreshed the living room with plants and soft colors, small actions, but each one was a brick in the rebuilding of the woman she had always been. She had just forgotten for a while. Beth, her sister, began visiting her more often. They drank tea on the porch and talked about everything, including Beth's silence during the years Stephanie had suffered in silence. "I didn't know what to do," Beth confessed during one of those visits, "but I'm here now." And that was enough. Elena, the cousin who had always been more like a sister, showed up with a handmade wooden crib, an heirloom from their great-grandmother. "It's to remind you that you come from a lineage of women who never bow their heads," she said. And Jenny? Jenny remained a rock, lawyer, friend, advisor, shoulder to lean on. A trio of women who, each in her own way, formed a solid network of affection and strength around Stephanie. It was there, among them, that she found her new compass. While Stephanie rebuilt her life in silence and consistency, Brandon began to feel the effects of his own poison. News of the Christmas dinner spread quickly through their social circles, and it wasn't her who spread it. It was the guests themselves, shocked by how everything unfolded. Friends started to drift away. Those who used to laugh at his jokes realized, too late, how much they had contributed to the abusive environment. Some tried to apologize to Stephanie for the jokes, the complicit silences, the times they saw and chose not to see. Others simply disappeared, consumed by shame. Brandon, on the other hand, became known as the man who tried to humiliate his wife and ended up humiliated by her, with class, evidence, and pregnancy. At work, he tried to keep up appearances, but even there, His image began to crumble. Clients whispered, colleagues gossiped, and the arrogant posture that once impressed was now seen for what it was, the disguise of an insecure man. Nate, who had always been his partner in sarcasm, now avoided him. "You exposed." "In me," he said during a brief and tense meeting, cutting ties. The isolation crept in slowly, like a receding tide. Brandon, who had always fed off applause and flattery, now found himself surrounded by echoes. Stephanie, for her part, didn't seek revenge, but in silence received life's justice. With each new update, she simply reaffirmed what she already knew. He had dug his own hole, and she had simply chosen not to fall in with him. Months later, the baby was born. A girl. Stephanie chose the name Maya, which means inner strength. The birth was peaceful, attended by a team she had carefully chosen herself. Jenny was there, holding her hand, while Beth and Elena waited in the reception area with tears in their eyes. When Maya cried for the first time, Stephanie felt as if that sound filled every empty space Brandon had left behind. It wasn't just the birth of a child, but the rebirth of an entire woman. Taking care of Maya became more than motherhood. It became an act of resistance, of healing, of a daily choice for a different future. Every sleepless night, every diaper changed, every bath given was also an affirmation. She could. She was capable. She was enough. Motherhood didn't erase the pains of the past, but gave them new meaning. Stephanie didn't romanticize what she had lived through. She didn't pretend everything was fine all the time. Some days, she still cried in the shower, not over Brandon, but over the time she had wasted trying to fit where she never belonged. Some days, she felt fear of repeating patterns, fear of failing her daughter, fear of still carrying invisible scars. But those days passed, and every time Maya smiled, squeezed her finger tightly, or fell asleep in her arms, she remembered she had won, not because Brandon fell, but because she chose to rise, because she rebuilt her identity without needing anyone else's validation, because finally she looked in the mirror and said, "I'm back."